So hello and welcome back yet again to Charles Dickens's A Tale of Two Cities, where no time at all has passed for me. Well, about 20 minutes or so while I uploaded the last chapter, and it has started raining. If it stays just rain, I'll get to keep my power on, which is a good thing. But just in case, I'm going to record a few more chapters just to keep you guys from having to wait in case I lose power. So, in the last chapter, Lucy has discovered a place where for over a year she went and stood 2 hours a day, even though one of the chief people of the revolution was there to watch her so that Charles could see her from his prison window sometimes. And then at the very end, kind of confusingly, some mystery person has met Mr. Lorry. I was a little confused by all that. Hopefully today's chapter will make that all more clear what's going on. I don't know. But the big important thing in the last chapter was Charles is finally going to get a trial. Somehow I don't think it's going to be a very fair trial, but he's getting a trial, and the doctor is pretty sure that he can just get him out of prison. Everything will be fine. So that is where we left off, and we are going to be picking back up in Book 3 of A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens, with Chapter 6, which is titled Triumph. The dread tribunal of 5 judges, the public prosecutor, a determined jury, sat every day. Their lists went forth every evening and were read out by the jailers of the various prisons to their prisoners. The standard jailer joke was, "Come out and listen to the evening paper, you inside there." "Charles Evrémonde," called Darnay. So at last began the evening paper at La Force. When a name was called, its owner stepped apart into a spot reserved for those who were announced as being thus fatally recorded. Charles Evrémonde, called Darnay, had reason to know the usage. He had seen hundreds pass away like this. His bloated jailer, who wore spectacles to read with, glanced over them to assure himself that Charles had taken his place and went through the list, making a similar short pause by each name. There were 23 names, but only 20 were responded to, for one of the prisoners so summoned had died in jail and had been forgotten, and 2 had been already guillotined and forgotten. The list was read in the vaulted chamber where Darnay had seen the associated prisoners upon the night of his arrival. Every one of those had perished in the massacre. Every human creature he had since cared for and parted with had already died upon the scaffold. There were hurried words of farewell and kindness, but the parting was soon over. It was the incident of every day, and the Society of La Force were engaged in preparation of some game of forfeits and a little concert that evening. They crowded to the grates and shed tears there, but 20 paces in the projected entertainments had to be refilled, and the time was at best short to the lock-up hour, when the common rooms and corridors would be delivered over to the great dogs who kept watch through the night. The prisoners were far from insensible or unfeeling. Their ways arose out of the condition of the time. Similarly, though with a subtle difference, a species of fever or intoxication, known without doubt to have led some people to brave the guillotine unnecessarily and to die by it, were not mere boastfulness, but a wild infection of the wildly shaken public mind. In seasons of pestilence, some of us will have a secret attraction to the disease, a terrible passing inclination to die from it. And all of us have like wonders hidden in our breasts, only needing the right circumstance to evoke them. The passage to the concierge was short and dark, the night in its vermin-haunted cells long and cold. Next day, 15 prisoners were put to the bar before Charles Darnay's name was called. All 15 were condemned, and the trials of the whole occupied only an hour and a half. Charles Evrémonde, called Darnay, was at length arraigned. His judges sat upon the bench in feathered hats, but the rough red cap and tricolored cacande was the headdress otherwise prevailing. Looking at the jury and at the turbulent audience, he might have thought the usual order of things was reversed, and that the felons were trying the honest men. The lowest, cruelest, and worst populace of the city, never without its quantity of low, cruel, and bad, were the directing spirits of the scene, noisily commenting, applauding, disapproving, anticipating, and precipitating the result without check. Of the men, the greater part were armed in various ways. Of the women, some wore knives, some daggers, some ate and drank as they looked on. Many were knitting. Among these last was one with a spare piece of knitting under her arm as she worked. She was in a front row, by the side of a man whom he had never seen since his arrival at the barrier, but who he directly remembered as Monsieur Defarge. He noticed that she once or twice whispered in his ear, and that she seemed to be his wife, but what he most noticed in the two figures was that although they were posted as close to himself as could be, they never looked at him. They seemed to be waiting for something with a dogged determination, and they looked at the jury, but nothing else. Under the president sat Dr. Manette in his usual quiet dress. As well as the prisoner could see, he and Mr. Lorry were the only men there unconnected with the tribunal who wore their usual clothes and had not assumed the coarse garb of the Carmongal. Charles Evrémonde, called Darnay, was accused by the public prosecutor as an aristocrat and an immigrant whose life was forfeit to the Republic under the decree which banished all immigrants upon the pain of death. It was nothing that the decree bore date since his return to France. There he was, and there was the decree. He had been taken in France, and so his head was demanded. "Take off his head!" cried the audience. "An enemy to the Republic!" The president rang his bell to silence those cries, and asked the prisoner whether it was not true that he had lived many years in England. Undoubtedly it was. Was he not an immigrant then? What did he call himself? Not an immigrant, said Charles. At least he hoped within the sense and spirit of the law. And why not? The president desired to know. Because he had voluntarily relinquished a title that was distasteful to him, and a station that was distasteful to him, and he had left his country. He submitted before the word immigrant in its present anticipation by the tribunal had in use, and lived by his own industry in England, rather than upon the industry of the overladen people of France. And what was his proof? Asked the judge. He handed in the names of two witnesses, Theopold Gabelle and Alexandre Manette. Had he not married in England? The president reminded him. True, said Charles, but not to an Englishwoman. A citizeness of France? Yes, Charles said, by birth. And her name and family? Lucy Manette, only daughter of Dr. Manette, only daughter of Dr. Manette, the good physician who is sitting here. This answer had a happy effect upon the audience. Cries in exultation of the well-known good physician rang through the hall. So capriciously were the people moved that tears immediately rolled down several ferocious faces that had been glaring at the prisoner a moment before, as if with impatience to pluck him out into the streets and do away with him. On these few steps of his dangerous way, Charles Darnay had set his foot according to Dr. Manette's reiterated instructions. The same cautious counsel directed every step in front of him and had prepared every inch of his road ahead. The president asked, why had he returned to France when he did and not sooner? Charles replied he had not returned sooner simply because he had no means of living in France save those he had given up, whereas in England he lived by giving instruction in the French language and literature. He had returned, when he did, on the pressing and written entreaty of a French citizen who represented that his life was in danger by Charles's absence. He had come back to save a citizen's life and to bear his testimony at whatever personal hazard to the truth. Was this criminal in the eyes of the Republic? The populace cried, "No!" and the president rang his bell to quiet them, which it did not, for they continued to cry "No" until they left off of their own free will. The president then asked the name of that citizen, and Charles explained that the citizen was his first witness. He also referred with confidence to the citizen's letter, which had been taken from him at the barrier, but which he did not doubt would be found among the papers in front of the president himself. The doctor had taken great care that it should be there, had assured Charles that it would be there, and at this stage of the proceedings it was then produced and read. Citizen Gabelle was called to confirm it, and did. Citizen Gabelle hinted, with infinite delicacy and politeness, that in the pressure of the business imposed on the tribunal by the multitude of enemies of the Republic with which it had to deal, he had been slightly overlooked in his prison of the Abbaye. In fact, had rather passed out of the tribunal's patriotic remembrance totally until just 3 days ago, when he had been summoned before it and had been set at liberty on the jury's declaring themselves satisfied that the accusation against him was answered as to himself by the surrender of the citizen Evermond, known as Darnay. Dr. Manette was next questioned. His high personal popularity and the clearness of his answers made a great impression, but as he proceeded, as he showed that the accused was his first friend on his release from his long imprisonment, that the accused had remained in England, always faithful and devoted to his daughter and himself in their exile, that so far from being in favor with the aristocrat government of France, he had actually been tried for his life by it, as the foe of England and a friend of the United States. As he brought these circumstances into view with the greatest discretion and straightforward force of truth and earnestness, the jury and the populace became as one. At last, when he appealed by name to Monsieur Lorry, an English gentleman there and then present, who, like himself, had been a witness on that English trial and could corroborate his account of it, the jury declared that they had heard enough, and that they were ready with their votes if the president were content to receive them. At every vote, the jury voted aloud and individually. The populace set up a short shout of applause. All the voices were in the prisoner's favor, and the president declared him free. Then began one of those extraordinary scenes which the populace sometimes gratified their fickleness or their better impulses towards generosity and mercy, or which they regarded as some set off against their swollen account of rage. No man can decide now to which of these motives such extraordinary scenes were referable. It is probable to a blending of all three, with the second predominating. No sooner was the acquittal pronounced than tears were shed as freely as blood at another time, and such fraternal embraces were bestowed upon the prisoner by as many of both sexes as could rush at him, that after his long, unwholesome confinement, he was in danger of fainting from exhaustion, none the less because he knew very well that the very same people carried by another current would have rushed at him with the same intensity to rip him to pieces in the streets. His removal, to make way for other accused persons who were to be tried, rescued him from these caresses for the moment. 5 were to be tried together next as enemies of the Republic, forasmuch as they had not assisted it by word or deed. So quick was the tribunal to compensate itself and the nation for a chance lost, that these 5 came down to him before he left the palace, all condemned to die within the next 24 hours. The first of them told him so with the customary prison sign of death, a raised finger, and they all added out loud, "Long live the Republic." The 5 had, it is true, no audience to lengthen their proceedings, for when Charles and Dr. Manette emerged from the gate, there was a huge crowd around it, in which there seemed to be every face he had seen in the court, except 2 for which he looked in vain. On his coming out, the concourse made at him anew, weeping, embracing, and shouting by turns all in together, until the very tide of the river on the bank of which the mad scene was acted out seemed to run mad like the people on the shore. They put him into a great chair that they had among them, which they had taken either out of the court itself or one of its rooms or passages. Over the chair they had thrown a red flag, and to the back of it they had bound up a pike with a red cap on its top. In this car of triumph, not even the doctor's entreaties could prevent his being carried to his home upon men's shoulders, with a confused sea of red caps heaving around him, and casting up to sight from the stormy deep such wrecks of faces that he more than once misdoubted his mind being in confusion, and that he was in the Turnbull on the way to the guillotine. In wild, dreamlike procession, embracing whom they met and pointing him out, they carried him on, reddening the snowy streets with the prevailing Republican color, in winding and trampling through them, as they had reddened them below the snow with a deeper dye. They carried him thus to the courtyard of the building where he lived. His father had gone on before to prepare Lucy, and when her husband stood upon his feet, she dropped insensible in his arms. As he held her to his heart and turned her beautiful head between his face and the crowd, so that his tears and her lips might come together unseen, a few of the people fell to dancing. Instantly the rest fell to dancing, and the courtyard overflowed with the carmongle. Then they elevated into the vacant chair a young woman from the crowd to be carried as the goddess of liberty, and all along the swelling banks, outflowing onto the adjacent streets, the carmongle absorbed them every one and whirled them away. After grasping the doctor's hand, as he stood victorious and proud before him, after grasping the hand of Mr. Lorry, who came panting in, breathless from his struggle against the waterspout of the carmongle, after kissing little Lucy, who was lifted up to clasp her arms around his neck, and After embracing the ever zealous and faithful Miss Pross who lifted her, Charles took his wife in his arms and carried her up to their rooms. "Lucy, I am safe."
"Oh, dearest Charles, let me thank God for this on my knees as I prayed."
They reverently bowed heads and hearts, and when she was again in his arms, he said, "And now, speak to your father, dearest. No other man in all of France could have done what he has done for me." Lucy laid her head upon her father's chest as she had laid his poor head on hers so long ago. He was happy in the return he had made to her, and he was paid for his suffering. He was proud of his strength. "You must not be weak, my darling," he said. "Don't tremble so. I have saved him." And that is the end of the chapter, but not the end of the book. It seems like we got our happy ending, and there's still a decent chunk of book left. Like a good chunk of book left. So I'm kind of curious as to what's still to come, because seems like we could almost end the book right there. But that is where we are going to leave it. So thank you again, as always, for listening. I hope that you enjoyed that chapter where, yay, we win. How do we still have like 10 or 12 chapters left? I'm confused, but I guess we'll find out tomorrow. Please do hit the thumbs up on your way out. It does always make me smile, and I'll see you later.